Speaking of Wilbur 5,
Yes.
what applications to integral practice do you see springing from the 8 perspectives?
Yeah.
Particularly upper right autopoiesis and lower right autopoiesis. I'm a little bit fuzzy about those.
Yeah. Yeah. Fuzzy about them, just what they mean, or fuzzy about them, how they would fit into practice, or both? Both. Well, that's those of you who are following this, the question has to do with looking at the quadrants in the upper right and looking at autopoiesis and how exactly, first of all, what does that mean? How does it actually fit with a perspective? And then the slightly harder part, what the heck does that have to do with practice? And so I'll give kind of a very brief rundown. Autopoiesis was introduced primarily by Maturana and Varela. And Francisco Varela is a founding member of Integral Institute and a genius. And his untimely death recently probably kept him out of the Nobel Prize, although it might be given posthumously. It's a really brilliant discovery. Now, what he did basically is he and his colleagues were looking at the cognition of living organisms, such as deers or worms or frogs, for example. And what Varela and his associates noticed is that all of the biological descriptions of how a frog sees were done from the outside. It's some scientist at a formal, operational, rational level, sort of using rational cognition, looking at the frog, saying, this is what the frog sees. And then generally they would come up with also some sort of systems theory, say that the frog is part of an ecological system, and so on, and that's how you describe a frog. And Varela and company shocked the biological world by saying, actually, systems theory is irrelevant when it comes to a frog's biological cognition, because the frog doesn't see a system. The scientist sees the system, the frog doesn't. So, because the frog is just down there in its own pod going, here to rivet, 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 and all I can see is a few things around it, like fly moving, fly, yummy fly moving, fly on my tongue moving. So the idea was how to actually come up with what they called a biological phenomenology, the view from the inside of an organism. Now that's a fascinating thing to think about, because you can still do it in sort of a scientific third-person way, but they actually got down and said, this is what a frog would see. This is how cognition is created. This is the phenomenology of a frog. So in the upper right quadrant, they were actually given not the outside view of an atom, molecule, cell, and so on, but the inside view. So that's one way of talking about what that inside view means. Now, when they did that, they had to also come up with a new model of biology, which is how do organisms actually perceive? And what's the structure of an organism doing that? And what they would find is that this organism, all organisms, are self-maintaining, self-making, or self-creating. That's autopoiesis, self-making. And so that was also a radically new way of looking at what biological organisms were doing. So that is sort of, it's still they made it very clear they weren't trying to get into sort of like the feelings of what a frog is doing, because they're still describing the inside. This gets a little complicated. They're describing the view from within, but they're looking at it from without. And they were, which is it's a step, but it's still in the upper right quadrant. And very brilliantly, they said, we're not trying to get into the inside view of the frog. In other words, an actual feeling phenomenology of what the frog is feeling. Strangely, another philosopher attempted to do something like that. It was Alfred North Whitehead. And he revolutionized philosophy by doing the same thing in the upper left, which is let's look at not just what human beings see, but what frogs see, what deer see, what molecules might feel, what an atom might feel. And he came up with a notion of prehension. And so he tried to give a sort of inside view of what every single entity feels in the upper left. So when I was sort of writing volume 2 and wanting to talk about these 8 perspectives, which are the perspectives from the inside and the outside of a holon in each of these 4 quadrants. And we could walk through them and have the same amount of excitement we just experienced, be experienced in the other quadrants. So we'll hold that open as an exciting kind of possibility. But you can actually, if you just stand back and look at a holon in those 4 quadrants, and the quadrants are already defined as sort of first person and third person and so on. They're taking those into account. So if you have a holon in each of these 4 quadrants, you can look at it from the inside to the outside. And that's actually, if you look at it from the inside, that's autopoiesis in the upper right. If you look at it from the outside, it's standard empiricism or behaviorism. In the lower right, you can do the same thing. You can get systems theory. But Nicholas Luhmann, probably the greatest living systems theorist, he also just died, unfortunately, applied autopoiesis to systems and gave the view from within of systems theory. Now, still, again, describing it, the view from within looked at from without, if that makes sense. Now, I'll tell you exactly how this applies to God very quickly, so hang on. You want to know this. And I'm afraid, I don't want anybody to fall asleep before we get to the God part, because it's way cool. So you have the holons then in the upper left and the lower left. And if you look at it from the interior, you get phenomenology. In other words, these are all well-known methodologies. If you look at it from the exterior, you get structuralism. And in the lower left, the we, if you look at it from the interior, you get hermeneutics. How do we understand each other? And if you look at it from the exterior, it's things like cultural anthropology and ethnomethodology. Now, the whole point of this is that these 8 methodologies, and there are more, but these are 8 fundamental methodologies, particularly phenomenology and empiricism and systems theory, that have been with us for a long time, hermeneutics. And the idea was that if you could use the quadrants and use inside and outside views of the quadrants and so on, you could actually generate these 8 major methodologies. Nobody knows how they fit together. Nobody knows how they relate. Basically, people just use one methodology and they condemn all the others. And that's sort of the essence of anti-integralism, is to say, I've got the one view and everything else sucks. Now, it relates directly to meditation, for example, because in the upper left, meditation does phenomenology. So you're going to get things like St. Teresa's description of what happens when you meditate, or the Vipassana stages when you meditate. Those are all first-person views of first-person things seen from the inside. All right, everybody got that? Let's go. So that's straight in the upper left. That's what you do when you meditate. If you look at a holon from the outside, you get the stages of development of Clare Graves, of spiral dynamics, of Carol Gilligan, of Piaget, of et cetera. You can't see those stages using meditation. And that's one of the major, major, major discoveries that we've made, is that sheer phenomenology of just looking and introspecting your awareness will give you extremely important things. It will give you, among other things, big mind and big heart. But let's say, just as an example of bringing it home, let's say you're doing big mind, big heart exercise. And we say, could I please speak to the voice of the concert pianist? No, because it doesn't exist yet. So these exercises in phenomenology can call forth ever-present states of awareness, but they can't call forth these kinds of stages that require usually 4 or 5 years to build. So if you use spiral dynamics, if you take somebody who's at blue, and they're literally at blue, they haven't developed anything higher, and you say, let me talk to the voice of turquoise, it's not going to happen. And here was the catastrophe of, if you use only Western approaches, or if you use only Eastern approaches, you're leaving out half the story of the I. And so part of what we want to try to do is bring these together. Because here's what we find. You can take somebody at blue, and they can go through meditative training and go through gross states, meditative states, into subtle states, even into states of Nirod, Nirvikalpa, Samadhi, and Savikalpa. When they come out, they're still at blue. Okay? So that has been the catastrophe of trying to introduce Dharma into the Western world. It just hasn't been understood. You can't find this in any Dharmic texts. But on the other hand, the Western stages, chugging along, orange, okay, green, okay, turquoise. Nothing in those inherently is spiritual, you must have noticed. And so, where in the hell does spirituality fit into these things? Most of the stage conceptions in the West first of all, don't get high enough to get into transpersonal stages, but they also don't understand states that can occur at any of those stages. So the first thing we noticed doing these 8 primordial perspectives is we could see where a tradition was really strong and where it was just catastrophically not informed, through no fault of his own. It's just using its phenomenology in a way that is wonderful but doesn't get to these other aspects. And the 4 quadrants are aspects of you. So that means that these trainings are getting to some of these aspects that absolutely have to be contacted, but not getting to others. So the inside and the outside view of these various holons are first alerted us to doing this. Now, ultimately now we'll come back and see if this addressed your issue. But ultimately, how does this actually then apply? And could there be practices based on this without you having to, be able to repeat what I just said? And the general idea is these perspectives, the more you try to do this, the more you say, okay, this is what a frog is seeing from the inside. Or this is, if I look inside myself, I can see this experience. Right now, we're forming a we of mutual understanding. And the more we talk, the more we understand each other. So a we is forming. And so that's part of our experience and awareness as well. Every time you do that, that's simply a perspective that the one and only self is taking. So if we can use Vedanta terms for a moment and talk in a very clunky metaphorical way, forgive me those of you who know the subtleties of this, but one self is taking all of these perspectives. And the more you just put your mind in those perspectives, the more it sort of leaves stretch marks on your mind. It opens it to the perspectives that your own highest self is taking anyway. So to the extent you start doing that, you are actually seeing how one self can look through many eyes and take these different perspectives and look at something from the inside, look at something from the outside. David Data actually was very serious about starting something that he called the yoga of indigenous perspectives, which would be an actual practice, not quite as intellectual as I gave it, but of being able to adopt these different perspectives, again, just as a way to inhabit that aspect of your awareness that can do this. Because your transcendental self not only can do it, it's doing it all the time. So there is a simplicity, there's an isness on the absolute plane. Traditions make a distinction between absolute and relative truth. On the relative plane, 8 perspectives. On the absolute plane, pure presence. So when that pure presence comes into the manifest world, it can take up these different kinds of perspectives. Now, it doesn't mean you have to do it all the time, but it means that yourself is doing it in any event. And that's why you can relate to every perspective that's taken up. So we can also combine that, though, and we can simplify it into gross, subtle, and causal bodies and stuff like that. But it's a way to fundamentally look at the capacities of this highest self that you have. And that's really extraordinary because, again, this is right at the leading edge of doing something like this. And what we expect to find is bringing together these methodologies, all of which have pioneered one of them, and then say, okay, how can we shake those down into a yoga of 8 perspectives? So that's where we are kind of on that leading edge. I think it's very exciting. It's just really quite sort of